My leg wasn't worth $5,000 to them. I didn't know it yet, but someone was already preparing to ask questions I couldn't answer. Heat crawled up my neck as I pressed the phone harder against my ear. My boot was half unlaced because my knee had swollen so much the fabric strained against the gauze underneath. Dad had just told me they'd bought a boat. Mom sighed like I was being difficult. My sister laughed in the background and said I'd figure it out because I always did. The call ended, and I sat there staring at the scrap of paper from the clinic with the surgery costs written in blue pen, trying to understand how the people who raised me had just chosen a boat over my ability to walk without permanent damage. I wish I could say the betrayal began there, but it started 2 weeks earlier when I was still convinced they were the kind of people who showed up when it mattered. I was stationed about 2 hours from home when it happened. The injury was supposed to be routine training, the kind of thing that ends with ice and a few days of rest. I was working as an army medic, so I'd seen plenty of minor sprains and strains walk through the clinic. I knew what serious looked like and what wasn't. I knew the difference between someone being dramatic and someone actually hurt. This wasn't supposed to be serious. We were running a standard exercise, nothing complicated, nothing extreme. Just the kind of training we did every few weeks to stay sharp and keep protocols fresh. I'd done it dozens of times before. I stepped wrong during a transition drill. My foot landed on uneven ground and my knee twisted inward at an angle it wasn't designed to go. I heard the pop before I felt it. It was wet and loud, the kind of sound you don't forget once you've heard it. Then there was heat spreading through my knee like someone had poured something warm inside the joint. The pain came fast and sharp. I dropped, hard. My hands hit the dirt and I tried to push myself back up. But when I put weight on the leg, it just buckled beneath me like the connection between my brain and my muscles had been severed. Another medic got to me within seconds. He knelt down, checked the angle of my leg, looked at my face, and told me not to move. He didn't say it casually or like he was being cautious. He said it the way we say things when we mean them. The way you tell someone not to touch a wound or not to pull out an object that's keeping them from bleeding out. I stayed still. They got me to the clinic and the swelling came on fast. Faster than I expected. By the time they had me in the exam room with my leg elevated, my knee looked like it belonged to someone else. It was swollen tight and hot to the touch. The physician's assistant came in, looked at it for maybe 10 seconds, and ordered an MRI. The images came back within an hour. The PA brought them up on the screen and didn't sugarcoat it. Significant structural damage. Torn ligament. Possible cartilage involvement. Surgery needed soon, preferably within the week, maybe sooner if we could manage it. Any delay risked long-term impairment or making the damage permanent. He said it matter-of-factly, the way medical professionals do when they're giving you information you need to act on, not information you get to sit with and think about. I asked about cost. Military coverage would handle most of it eventually, but there were gaps. The upfront portion and the timing meant I needed to move fast if I wanted to avoid complications. The PA explained that the on-base surgical schedule was backed up. If I wanted to get it done within the optimal window, I'd need to look at off-base options. That meant out-of-pocket costs up front that I'd be reimbursed for later, assuming I navigated the paperwork correctly. He wrote a number on a scrap of paper and slid it across the table. $5,000. Maybe more, depending on the specifics. He suggested I start making calls to see what I could arrange because the window for intervention was closing. I took the paper, folded it carefully, and put it in my pocket. I had $800 in my account. I'd always been good with money, careful and disciplined, the kind of person who tracked expenses and planned ahead. But this wasn't something I could budget my way out of. I needed help, and I needed it now. That night, I sat in the barracks with my leg wrapped and elevated on a pile of folded blankets. The gauze was already showing a faint red gloom where fluid was seeping through. Around me, people moved and talked and went about their routines. Someone laughed at something on their phone. A door slammed. The hum of conversation and activity felt distant, like it was happening in a different room even though it was all right there. I stared at my phone for 20 minutes before I made the call. My thumb hovered over Dad's name in my contacts. I didn't want to ask. I'd worked hard to not need them, to be the one who had it together and didn't create problems. But this was my leg and the clock was running. I pressed the button and listened to it ring. When Dad answered, I kept it clinical. I explained the injury in clear terms. Torn ligament, structural damage, urgent need for surgery. I explained the timeline, the cost, the reimbursement process. I told him I'd pay him back on schedule with interest if that's what he needed. I'd put it in writing. I'd make it official. But right now, I just needed help covering the upfront portion so I could get the surgery done before the damage became irreversible. I said it calmly because I thought calm would make it easier for him to say yes. Calm meant reasonable. Calm meant this was a solvable problem, not a crisis. There was a pause. I heard him exhale, that heavy breath people make when they're about to deliver bad news and want you to know it's hard for them to say it. Then he said the timing wasn't great. They'd just put money down on a boat. Things were tight. He said the knee would probably heal fine on its own if I gave it time and didn't push it. He said I shouldn't panic over what the doctor said because they always push for the expensive option. That's how they made money, scare you into procedures you didn't really need. I could feel my pulse in my throat, but I kept my voice steady. I told him this wasn't about panic. The MRI showed the damage. The physician's assistant had been clear about the timeline. This wasn't a sales pitch. This was medical reality. If I didn't address it now, I'd deal with it for the rest of my life. Mom got on the line then. Her voice had that soft edge she used when she wanted to sound reasonable and caring while delivering something that wasn't. She said she understood I was scared. She said it was natural to feel overwhelmed when something like this happened, but sometimes we had to learn to handle things on our own. She called it a lesson about choices and risks. She said I was strong and capable and I'd figure it out because I always did. She said it like it was encouragement, but it felt like dismissal. I asked if they could loan me even half, $2,500, anything to close the gap. Dad cut back in and said they'd already committed the funds and it wouldn't be responsible to pull back now. The boat was an investment in their future. They'd worked hard for it. They'd earned it. He said I'd understand when I was older and had to make those kinds of decisions. He said it like I was asking them to give up something essential, not asking for help to keep my leg functional. Then I heard my sister in the background. She laughed. Not cruelly exactly, but like the whole thing was kind of amusing, like I was being dramatic and everyone knew it. She said something to Mom, and then her voice got clearer, like she'd moved closer to the phone. She said I'd figure it out because I was tough. She said I always landed on my feet. She said it like being tough meant I didn't need help, like my ability to endure meant I should. Like my leg bleeding through the gauze was just another problem I'd solve because that's what I did and that's what they expected. The call ended shortly after that. Dad said they had to go. Mom said to keep them updated. My sister said something else I didn't quite catch. Then the line went dead and I sat there in the barracks with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to silence. For a few minutes I didn't move. I just sat there feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into my chest. Then I stood up carefully, grabbed my crutches, and made my way outside. The air was cooler, quieter. I found a spot away from the doors and the noise, and I stopped. I whispered a short prayer. I asked for restraint, for the ability to not beg and not lash out, to just focus on the next right action. I asked for clarity instead of anger, for discipline instead of desperation. I didn't feel peace exactly. I didn't feel calm, but I felt the anger settle into something more like resolve. Begging wouldn't change their answer. Yelling wouldn't either. Explaining it again in different words wouldn't make them hear me. I needed to move forward with what I had and figure out the rest. 2 days later, I was back at my small apartment off base. It wasn't much. 1 bedroom, a kitchen, barely big enough to turn around in, furniture I'd picked up secondhand. But it was mine, and it was quiet and right now that felt like enough. I sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a calculator, running the numbers over and over like maybe this time they'd add up differently. I'd pulled what I could from my account, $800. I'd called about payment plans. Some places offered them, but not enough to cover the gap. I'd looked into medical credit lines. The approval process would take too long. I was still $3,000 short, and the surgery was in 5 days. 5 days before the window closed and the damage became something I'd carry permanently. I was on crutches, and every step reminded me the clock was still running. Then someone knocked on the door, sharp and deliberate. I grabbed the crutches and hobbled over, expecting maybe a neighbor or a delivery I'd forgotten about. I opened it to find my brother standing there. He looked exhausted, still in his work clothes from the mechanic shop where he'd been employed for the past 3 years. Grease under his nails, dirt on his boots. His hair was messy, like he'd been running his hands through it. He looked at my leg, at the way I was balancing on the crutches, and then at my face. He said, "They didn't help you, did they?" It wasn't really a question. I shook my head. He didn't ask for details. He didn't ask what they'd said, or why they'd refused, or if I'd explained it properly. He just reached into his jacket and pulled out a wad of crumpled bills held together with a rubber band. He held it out to me. $800. I stared at it. I asked where it came from. He said he'd sold his tools. The good ones. The set he'd been collecting for years, piece by piece, saving up for the expensive brands that lasted. The ones that made his work easier and faster. The ones he was proud of. He said he'd figure out how to replace them later, but right now I needed to be able to walk. I told him he needed those tools for work. They weren't optional. They were how he made a living. He looked at me and said he needed me to not be crippled more. He said it plain and direct, like it was the only calculation that mattered. My leg versus his tools. It wasn't even a choice. I took the money because arguing felt disrespectful, because I knew he meant it, and refusing would hurt him more than accepting. I stood there with that cash in my hand, those bills that smelled like motor oil and work, and I realized this was the moment I'd remember. Not the refusal from my parents, not the laughter or the lesson about handling things alone. This, the person who showed up when I was bleeding, the person who gave everything when he had the least to give. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with my leg propped up on pillows, staring at the ceiling, and I kept replaying the patterns I'd tried to ignore for years. The favoritism I told myself wasn't real or wasn't that bad. The double standards I'd accepted as just the way things were. My sister had always been the investment. That's how I'd come to think of it, though I'd never said it out loud. When her first business idea failed, a boutique that lasted 6 months before she ran out of inventory and interest, they funded the second one. An online store selling handmade crafts she didn't actually make herself. When that collapsed after a year of inconsistent orders and poor reviews, they funded a third attempt, a lifestyle blog that never gained traction. No contracts, no interest, no deadlines, no expectations beyond vague encouragement, just faith that she'd eventually figure it out. They called it supporting her potential. When my car transmission failed 2 years earlier, I'd asked for a loan to cover the repair. I'd needed $1,200. I'd explained I could pay it back within 6 months if they could just help me get the car running again so I could get to work. They'd said yes, but only after I signed a contract. A real contract with interest and repayment terms. They'd had it notarized. I'd signed it in the kitchen while Mom made coffee and acted like this was normal and reasonable, like this was how families handled things. I'd paid it back in 4 months instead of 6, skipping meals and picking up extra shifts to make it happen. I'd done it early because I'd thought that discipline would earn something. Respect, maybe. Acknowledgement that I was reliable. Instead, it just confirmed to them that I could handle things on my own. It hardened their expectation that I didn't need help because I never complained. Because I never failed. because I always figured it out. Now I was lying here with a knee that might never work right again, holding $800 from a brother who'd sold his livelihood to give it to me, and realizing they'd always had money. They'd always had resources. They just didn't have them for me. The boat proved that. $12,000 for a boat while I was asking for $5,000 for surgery. The refusal wasn't about resources. It wasn't about timing. It was about where I ranked, and I ranked below a boat. I didn't sleep much that week. I spent the days calling lenders and researching loan options and running calculations until my eyes hurt. I didn't want debt. I'd worked hard to avoid it. But I wanted to walk without paying more. I wanted to run again. I wanted to do my job without wondering if my knee would give out at the wrong moment. Finally, I found a personal loan with terms I could manage if I stayed disciplined. The interest rate wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. 14%. The repayment timeline stretched out over 3 years, longer than I wanted. I'd be paying it down slowly, chipping away at it month after month. But it was enough to cover the gap. It would get me to surgery before the window closed. I set up an appointment to sign the paperwork. The lending office was small and impersonal, tucked into a strip mall between the tax service and a nail salon. The loan officer was polite and efficient. She walked me through the terms, pointed out the important sections, explained the penalties for late payment. Then she slid the papers across the desk and handed me a pen. I sat there staring at the numbers on the page. The interest rate, the monthly payment, the total amount I'd pay back over 3 years, which was significantly more than the original $5,000. I thought about calling home one more time, asking if they changed their mind, explaining that I was about to take on debt I didn't want because they'd chosen not to help. Maybe hearing that would shift something. Then I thought about my sister, laughing, about my mother calling it a lesson, about my father saying the boat was an investment in their future. I thought about my brother's tools being sold so I could have $800. And I steadied myself. I chose disciplined action, the kind that moved forward even when the path wasn't clear or comfortable, the kind that trusted things would work out if I did what needed to be done. Proverbs 35:6 came to mind, the passage about trusting with your whole heart and not leaning on your own understanding, about acknowledging God in your decisions and trusting that your path would be made straight. I signed the papers. I signed them carefully and deliberately. I made the choice to carry this alone. The surgery happened 2 days later. I checked in early in the morning, filled out the forms, changed into the hospital gown, and lay on the gurney while they prepped me. The surgeon came in to review the procedure one more time. He was calm and confident, the kind of presence that made you feel like you were in good hands. He said it was a straightforward repair, that he'd done hundreds of these, that I should be fine as long as I followed the rehab protocol. Then they wheeled me back and put me under. I woke up groggy and disoriented with my leg in a brace that went from mid-thigh to ankle. The surgeon was there. He told me it had gone well. The tear was repaired. The cartilage was intact enough that he didn't need to do additional work. I'd need physical therapy in time, but I'd walk normally again if I followed the protocol and didn't rush it. Relief hit me so hard, I almost cried right there in the recovery room. But I didn't. I just thanked him and asked when I could start rehab. He said 2 weeks. Rest first. Then we'd begin rebuilding strength and range of motion. I nodded. 2 weeks felt like forever, but I could do 2 weeks. I'd done harder things. Recovery was slow, slower than I wanted, slower than I expected. The first week I could barely move without pain. Getting from the bed to the bathroom felt like an expedition. Simple tasks like putting on pants or getting a glass of water from the kitchen required planning and effort. I kept my leg elevated and iced it religiously and took the pain medication they prescribed, even though I hated how it made me feel foggy and disconnected. The second week was marginally better. I could get around my apartment with crutches without wanting to cry. The swelling had gone down significantly. The surgical site was healing cleanly. By the 3rd week, I started physical therapy. The first session was humbling. The therapist was kind but direct. She had me do basic movements that should have been easy. Bending my knee 10 degrees, straightening it fully, bearing weight while holding the parallel bars. Everything hurt and everything felt weak. My leg didn't feel like mine. It felt like a liability I was dragging around. A piece of equipment that had malfunctioned and now needed extensive repairs. But I did every exercise they gave me, every single one, exactly as prescribed. I kept a notebook and tracked my progress with the kind of detail I usually reserve for mission planning. Range of motion measurements, pain levels, strength indicators, how many repetitions I could complete before failure. I pushed through every session even when it hurt, even when my knee felt like it was filled with broken glass, even when the therapist said I could take it easier if I needed to. The therapist commented once that I approached rehab like it was combat training. I told her it was. This was the fight to walk normally again, to run, to do my job without wondering if my knee would give out at the wrong moment. Losing wasn't an option. My brother checked in constantly. He called every few days, asked if I needed anything, offered to bring groceries or just sit with me if I was going stir-crazy in the apartment. I told him I was fine. Mostly I was. The knee was healing. I was managing the loan payments on schedule. I was moving forward. But something had shifted. I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that they'd chosen a boat over my body and expected me to just accept it. That they'd laughed and called it a lesson when I'd asked for help during an actual medical emergency. That my brother, who had so little, had given everything without hesitation, while they, who had plenty, had given nothing. Then, about a month into recovery, I was scrolling through some documents on my laptop for an unrelated administrative task. Updating contact information for something routine. My personnel file needed a current emergency contact. I was clicking through folders, half paying attention, when I accidentally opened a shared family file system I still had access to from years ago when we'd used it for holiday planning and document sharing. I hadn't looked at it in a long time. Years, probably. I was about to close it when I saw a folder labeled with my father's name and the year before last. Something about seeing it there made me pause. I told myself I was just being nosy, that I shouldn't look, that it was probably just tax documents or mortgage paperwork or something equally boring. But I opened it anyway, maybe because some part of me already suspected, maybe because the refusal during my medical crisis had planted a seed of doubt that was finally breaking through the soil. Or maybe I was just angry and looking for validation. Inside were scans of forms, official documents, applications for benefit programs. I recognized some of them immediately because I'd helped soldiers fill them out before. Programs meant for people experiencing financial hardship. Programs that provided assistance with housing, food, medical expenses. Programs specifically designed for families who were genuinely struggling to meet basic needs. I started reading. The income numbers were wrong, not slightly wrong, not like someone had made an honest mistake. Completely fabricated. They'd claimed income levels far below what they actually made. They'd omitted assets. They'd misrepresented their financial situation so thoroughly that it would have taken deliberate effort to get it that wrong. I cross-referenced it with other things I knew. The boat purchase. The house, which was paid off. The money they'd been funneling to my sister for her various ventures. The new car Mom had bought the year before. None of it lined up with what they'd claimed on these forms. Not even close. I sat there staring at my screen, feeling something cold settle in my chest. They told me they couldn't help me because money was tight. They'd said the timing wasn't right. They'd framed my request as unreasonable, as me not understanding how hard they worked and how stretched they were. Meanwhile, they'd been lying to the system to get benefits they didn't qualify for. Benefits meant for people who actually needed them. People like the soldiers I served with who were barely scraping by on base pay. People who legitimately struggled to feed their families. I didn't do anything right away. I closed the laptop and sat there in my apartment feeling sick. I let it sit for a few days thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was an explanation I wasn't seeing. Maybe there was some context that made sense of it. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't poor record keeping or confusion about forms. It was deliberate. They'd lied about their finances to access resources they didn't need while refusing to help their own daughter with a medical emergency they could easily have covered. I thought about my sister laughing on that call. I thought about my mother's soft voice explaining that I needed to learn to handle things on my own. I thought about my brother's tools, sold and gone so I could have money for surgery. Then I thought about all the people who actually needed help and couldn't get it because resources were being siphoned away by people who lied. I thought about the single parents on base who struggled to afford childcare, the families who used food banks because base pay didn't stretch far enough, the people who qualified for assistance but couldn't navigate the bureaucracy or didn't know the programs existed, and I thought about my parents taking money meant for them while looking me in the eye and telling me they couldn't spare $5,000. I made a decision. I wasn't going to call them. I wasn't going to give them a chance to explain or spin a story or make it sound like less than what it was. I wasn't going to warn them so they could cover it up or destroy records or manufacture some retroactive justification. I gathered the documentation I had access to, the forms, the applications, the dates and amounts. I organized it all cleanly and methodically. Then I submitted it to the appropriate oversight channels. I wrote a clear cover letter explaining what I'd found and why I was reporting it. I included a timeline. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't editorialize. I didn't add emotional commentary about being refused help or betrayed or anything personal. I just provided facts and let the system do what it was designed to do. Then I hit send and closed my laptop. I sat there for a while waiting to feel something dramatic. Guilt, maybe, or fear, or satisfaction. I didn't feel any of those things. I just felt calm. Steady, like I'd done what needed to be done, and now it was out of my hands. Nothing happened immediately. Days passed, then weeks. I went back to my routine. Physical therapy 3 times a week. Work shifts on base as I gradually returned to duty with modified responsibilities. Loan payments deducted automatically from my account on schedule. My knee was getting stronger. The range of motion was improving. I was walking with less pain, relying on the crutches less. Life was moving forward in the way it does, one small step at a time. But I knew something had been set in motion. I knew that somewhere, someone was reviewing what I'd sent. Someone was cross-checking records and asking questions and building a case. I knew it would land eventually. I just didn't know when. About 6 weeks after I submitted the report, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously. A woman identified herself as an investigator with the oversight agency. She said they'd received documentation and had some questions. She wanted to verify a few details, confirm my relationship to the individuals in question, clarify my access to the information I'd provided. The conversation was professional and brief. I answered her questions directly. Yes, these were my parents. Yes, I'd had legitimate access to these documents. No, I hadn't obtained them through any illegal means. Yes, I understood that this might result in an investigation. She thanked me for coming forward. She said someone would be in touch if they needed anything else. Then she hung up, and I stood there in my apartment holding my phone, feeling strangely calm. I'd done what I thought was right. The rest was up to the system now. A week after that conversation, my brother called. His voice was tight. Careful. He said Mom had tried to reach me and couldn't get through, which was accurate since I'd stopped answering their calls after the surgery. He asked if I knew anything about an investigation into their finances. I told him I did. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear him breathing, thinking. Then he asked, quiet and careful, if I was the one who'd reported them. I said yes. Another silence, longer this time. Then he asked why. His tone wasn't accusatory, just genuinely asking, trying to understand. I told him everything. About the forms I'd found, the income numbers that were completely wrong, the benefits they were claiming while refusing to help me with surgery, the pattern of lies that had been going on for who knows how long. I told him it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing them for saying no. It was about the fact that they'd lied to access resources meant for people who actually needed them while simultaneously refusing to help their own daughter during a medical crisis they could easily have covered. I told him it was about accuracy, about accountability, about the single parents and struggling families who deserve those resources, about the principle that you don't get to take what isn't yours and then act like you're the victim when someone points it out. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said he understood. He said it was going to get ugly. He said they'd be angry. But he understood why I'd done it. It did get ugly. Over the next several weeks, my parents tried calling me repeatedly. I didn't answer. They sent messages, first confused, then angry, then accusatory. They said I'd betrayed them, that I was destroying the family over a misunderstanding, that I was being vindictive because they couldn't help with one loan. My sister sent a message too, shorter, meaner. She called me petty and cruel. She said I was blowing up everyone's life because I was mad about not getting my way. She said I'd always been jealous of her, and this was proof. I didn't respond to any of them. There was nothing to say that wouldn't just escalate things. No explanation would make them understand. No defense would change their minds. They'd already decided I was the villain in this story, and nothing I said would shift that narrative. The investigation moved forward. I wasn't privy to all the details. I wasn't a party to the proceedings. But I heard pieces through my brother, who was caught in the middle and trying to navigate relationships with everyone. Audits were happening, interviews were being conducted, document requests were being sent. My parents hired a lawyer. They tried to frame it as an administrative error, a misunderstanding, poor record keeping. They said the forms had been confusing and they'd made honest mistakes. They said they'd never intended to deceive anyone. But the documentation was too clear, the pattern too established. It wasn't one form filled out incorrectly. It was years of consistent misrepresentation across multiple programs. The investigators saw through it, and the investigation continued. A few weeks into this process, my sister showed up at my apartment unannounced. I was inside when I heard the knock, confident, deliberate, 3 sharp raps like she expected to be let in immediately. I looked through the peephole and saw her standing there. She was dressed carefully, not casual, not like she'd just stopped by. Styled to look sympathetic, like she'd put thought into presenting herself as someone who cared. I didn't open the door. She knocked again. Then I heard her voice, slightly raised so it would carry through the door. She said it didn't have to be like this, that we were family, that this whole thing could have been worked out if I'd just talked to them first instead of going straight to the authorities. She made it sound reasonable, made it sound like I was the one being extreme. I stayed silent, watched through the peephole. She tried a different approach. Her voice got softer. She said she understood I was hurt, that she got why I felt the way I did about the surgery situation. But this was too much. This was destroying everyone. Mom was a mess. Dad was barely sleeping. They were losing everything, and for what? To prove a point? I spoke through the door, keeping my voice level. I said it wasn't about proving a point. I said they'd committed fraud, that they'd lied to access benefits they didn't qualify for while refusing to help me with an actual medical emergency, that those weren't equivalent situations. She pivoted again, said I was being extreme, that families help each other do mistakes, that turning them into investigators was vindictive, not principled. She said I was making it about the surgery money when it was really just about being angry they'd said no. She made it sound small, made it sound like I was throwing a tantrum that had gotten out of hand. I reminded her through the door that she'd laughed when I asked for help, that she'd said I'd figure it out because I always did, that she'd found it amusing while my leg was bleeding through gauze. Silence for a moment. Then she said I was twisting things, that she didn't mean it like that I was being unfair. I told her I wasn't opening the door, that we were done talking, that she could leave. She stood there for another minute. I watched her through the peephole. She wasn't leaving. She was thinking, calculating. Then she turned and walked down the hallway toward the stairs. But before she disappeared from view, I saw her pull out her phone. She was already calling someone, already moving to the next strategy, already looking for someone else who might apply pressure or mediate or convince me to back down. I stepped away from the door and sat down on my couch. The old dynamic had just failed at my threshold. The version of me who would have opened that door out of guilt or obligation or family programming was gone. I'd chosen the boundary and I'd held it, and it felt right. Around this same time, I started thinking about my brother, about what he'd given me, about the fact that he was still working at that mechanic shop with borrowed tools because he'd sold his own to help me. I had some savings, not a lot, but enough to do something meaningful. The shop where he worked was owned by an older man who'd been talking about retiring for years. I reached out to him carefully and discreetly, asked if he was still interested in selling. He was. We talked numbers, worked out terms. I scraped together what I had and arranged the financing for the rest. Then I set up the purchase and transferred ownership directly to my brother's name. I didn't tell him beforehand. I didn't ask permission. I just made it happen and let him find out when the legal paperwork came through. When he called me, his voice was shaking. He asked what I'd done. I told him I'd bought the shop and put it in his name. He was silent for a long moment. Then he asked why. His voice cracked slightly when he said it. I said because he'd sold his tools for me when I needed surgery. Because he'd given everything he had without hesitation. Because I wanted him to have something that was his. Something he could build without owing anyone. Something that was entirely his own. He didn't say anything for a long time. I heard him breathing on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Thank you," in a way that made me glad I'd done it. In a way that made the whole thing worth it. By then, the consequences for my parents were starting to become visible, not dramatic or explosive, just a steady erosion. Bank accounts were frozen pending the investigation. The house went quiet. They stopped going to their usual functions. My mother's lunch club, which she'd been part of for over a decade, quietly canceled her membership. The marina reassigned their boat slip to someone else. Friends who used to call regularly stopped reaching out. It wasn't that anyone was being openly hostile. It was just that people distanced themselves when scandal touched their social circle. I returned to duty gradually, following the medical protocol. Light duties first, administrative work. Then slowly back to full responsibilities as my knee proved it could handle the demands. My commanding officer gave me a brief nod of approval when he saw me back in uniform, noted that I carried myself well considering everything. He didn't know the details and I didn't offer them. I just focused on my work and my recovery. Around this time, my mother sent a letter. It arrived in my mailbox addressed in her careful handwriting. I recognized it immediately. I stood there holding it for a minute, debating whether to open it or just throw it away. Finally, I took it inside and sat down to read it. The letter was handwritten on nice stationery. She talked about hardship, about how difficult the investigation had been, about mistakes and misunderstandings and how families should forgive each other. She asked for forgiveness like it was something I owed. Like forgiveness meant pretending nothing had happened and going back to how things were before. She framed everything as a situation that had spiraled out of control. She suggested we could fix things if I just agreed to help make it right. Maybe if I wrote a letter saying I'd misunderstood the documents. Maybe if I said I regretted reporting them. Maybe if I helped them navigate the investigation and supported their version of events. I read it once. Then I folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and set it aside. I chose forgiveness as release, not as access. I'd learned the difference. Forgiveness didn't mean letting them back into my life. It didn't mean pretending the betrayal hadn't happened, or accepting their version of reality. It meant releasing the bitterness so it wouldn't poison me. It meant letting go of the anger so I could move forward unburdened. I prayed once, short and simple. I asked for freedom from bitterness, for the ability to let go without letting them back in. I thought about Romans 12:19, the passage about vengeance not being ours to claim and justice belonging to a higher authority. I'd already done what needed to be done. I'd reported fraud because it was fraud. I told the truth because the truth mattered. The consequences that followed were the natural result of their own choices, not something I'd inflicted on them out of spite. Now I just needed to keep the boundary in place, to resist the pull of guilt or obligation, or the old patterns that said I was supposed to fix things and make everyone comfortable and carry burdens that weren't mine to carry. About 3 months after I filed the initial report, there was a final meeting. My attorney was there. She was someone I'd hired to help me navigate the legal aspects of being a witness in the investigation. A representative from the oversight agency was there too, and my parents arrived separately, each with their own legal representation. The terms were laid out: repayment of fraudulently obtained benefits, significant financial penalties, probationary status that would last for years, no criminal charges, but steep consequences nonetheless. My father sat across the table from me, his face hard, and said I didn't have to ruin them, that this could have been handled quietly, that I'd chosen to blow up the family over something that could have been resolved privately. I kept my tone steady. I refused to humiliate them. I didn't list out all the ways they'd failed or betrayed me. I didn't catalog their hypocrisy or their cruelty. I just looked at him calmly and said, I didn't ruin you. I stopped saving you. There's a difference. He started to argue, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm. The meeting continued. Paperwork was signed. Arrangements were finalized. My mother didn't speak much. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. My sister wasn't there. I heard later she'd been distancing herself from the situation publicly, trying to protect her own image and social standing. The meeting ended without reconciliation. No apologies, no acknowledgement, just paperwork and legal arrangements and the finalization of consequences. They left separately. I stayed for a few minutes afterward, finishing up some last documents with my attorney. Time moved forward after that. Months passed. My parents stopped calling. The letters stopped coming. The attempts to reach out through mutual connections faded away. They'd moved from confusion to anger to blame, and now they landed on silence. My brother and I stayed in regular contact. The shop was doing well under his management. He'd expanded the services offered, hired 2 reliable employees, built up a loyal customer base. He sent me photos sometimes of work he was proud of. Custom projects, restorations, things he was building that mattered. He was creating something real. 6 months after the surgery, I went for a run early one morning on base. It was the first real run I'd attempted since the injury, not a jog or a careful pace on the treadmill, an actual run. I'd been cleared for it by both my physical therapist and the doctor, but I was still nervous. I started slow, focusing on my form and listening to my body. The knee held. No sharp pain, no instability, just the normal burn of muscles working and lungs pushing and the rhythm of feet hitting pavement. I ran 2 miles that morning. When I finished, I stood there in the cool air, hands on my hips, breathing hard, feeling the sweat cooling on my skin. I felt something close to peace. Not perfect, not complete, but real. The kind that comes from surviving something hard and coming out functional on the other side. My brother and I met for takeout a few days later. We sat in his office above the shop, eating directly from the containers because neither of us cared about plates. He told me business was good. He had steady work lined up for weeks. He was thinking about expanding again, maybe adding another bay. I told him my loan was almost paid off. Another 6 months and I'd be clear. We didn't talk about our parents much. There wasn't a need. He mentioned once that they'd tried reaching out to him, asking him to mediate or convince me to reconsider certain things. He declined. He said he'd told them that this place, this business, wasn't theirs and they should leave. He looked at me when he said it, checking to see if that was okay. I told him it was. I told him he didn't have to do that. He said he did. He said some boundaries needed to be clear and permanent. He said I'd finished what I started. I corrected him. I said I'd finished it, but not alone, that his help had made it possible, that the surgery and the recovery and the whole thing had only worked because he'd shown up when I was bleeding. He smiled at that, nodded. Understood. I thought a lot about family during those months of healing and moving forward, about what it means and what it doesn't mean. Family is supposed to be the people who show up when you're bleeding, the people who give when you have nothing left, the people who don't calculate cost or measure worth, not the people who laugh when you ask for help and then get angry when you stop asking. I don't regret what I did. I reported fraud because it was fraud. Not because they'd hurt my feelings, not because I wanted revenge, because they were taking resources meant for people who actually needed them while refusing to help their own daughter with a medical crisis. Because the truth mattered more than keeping everyone comfortable. I gave my brother a business because he gave me everything when he had nothing to spare. Because loyalty should flow both ways. Because family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who choose you and stand by you when standing is hard. I kept boundaries because boundaries aren't cruelty. They're not punishment. They're precision. They're clarity about who gets access and who doesn't, about who's earned trust and who's broken it, about protecting yourself from people who've demonstrated that they'll prioritize their comfort over your well-being every single time. Some people have asked if I went too far. Some have asked if I went far enough. I don't know that those are the right questions. I know I can walk without pain now. I know I can run. I know my brother has something he's building that's entirely his own. I know I sleep at night without wondering when the next betrayal is coming. I know I'm not responsible for saving people who won't save themselves. I'm still a medic. I still show up for people when they need help. I still believe in service and sacrifice and doing the hard thing when someone's life depends on it. But I've learned that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is stop enabling the lie. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let consequences land where they're earned. And sometimes family isn't about blood or obligation or maintaining appearances. It's about who stayed when staying was hard, who gave when giving hurt, who showed up when you were bleeding and everyone else had somewhere better to be. I don't talk to my parents anymore. I don't hate them, but I don't miss them either. There's no longing for reconciliation, no fantasy where they apologize and mean it, no hope that they'll suddenly understand what they did wrong. Those doors are closed, and they're closed for good reason. My sister reached out once through a mutual contact, asked if I'd consider talking, suggested maybe enough time had passed. I declined, not out of spite, out of clarity. Some doors close because the people on the other side have demonstrated too clearly that opening them again would only invite more harm. The boat got sold eventually. I don't know what they did with the money. It doesn't matter to me. That part of my life is finished. My knee works. My brother's business is thriving. I finished paying off the loan 2 months early by making extra payments when I could. I'm back to full duty, doing the work I trained for, serving with people I trust. And when I walk now, I walk without limping, without crutches, without hesitation. I walk without the weight of people who only valued me when I stayed quiet and small and asked for nothing. I walk free of the burden of pretending that loyalty flows only in one direction. I walk knowing I did the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it cost me relationships, even when everyone else said I should forgive and forget and move on as if nothing had happened. So did I go too far, or far enough? I think I went exactly as far as truth required. I think I honored the people who actually needed those resources by making sure fraud was exposed. I think I honored my brother by giving back what he'd sacrificed. I think I honored myself by refusing to carry shame for other people's choices, and I'd do it again, every part of it, every hard decision, every painful conversation, every boundary set and maintained, because at the end of the day, I can walk, and that matters more than keeping people comfortable who were willing to watch me suffer.